I have been told it cannot be touched, and they are always running up to it with Scotch tape to keep it going. So we're going to continue reading good, challenging, difficult literature. Works like Recollections of Joan of Arc by Mark Twain. Twain considered that his masterpiece. Translations of Beowulf. We'll read some narrative Shakespeare, and we'll read a little bit of Shakespeare in the original language as well. Teaching them and equipping them to deal with the complexities of difficult texts. So, content integration just means what I've talked about, the integrated units, but it also means throughout the curriculum, throughout the day, the emphasis on speaking well and writing well and being clear and complete in sentences. Classical education for the 21st century. Well, you know, one of the criticisms of it is, well, gee, it's so old. I mean, centuries ago, okay, fine, but what does this have to do with today? Well, there's a growing body of knowledge coming at us from the tech industry of all places, where we're finding tech executives are seeking liberally educated people because they have a broad enough understanding to be able to think in multiple ways and to communicate to diverse groups. Steve Jobs says it's in Apple's DNA that technology alone is not enough. It's technology married with liberal arts, married with humanities, that yields us the results that make our hearts sing. It's true. I mean, right now, Apple's working on some product that I won't be able to live without in 2 years. And they'll do this because they've been studying human behavior. It's interesting to note, too, I've done some work in San Francisco, so very close to Silicon Valley. Many of the tech execs of Silicon Valley send their kids to a school called the Waldorf School of the Peninsula. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with Waldorf models. No technology, all experiential learning. That's what they want for their kids. They understand technology is a tool. It's something that comes in handy. But kids need to be formed to think, and they need to be formed in literacy. So what are the fruits? Well, it's formative for students and teachers. So formed by this culture that develops the wisdom for tomorrow by building it on the wisdom of the past. We understand the role of virtue in both the individual and in our community. We'll develop broad knowledge that nurtures the ability to think critically and imaginatively. We'll be able to have kids who can communicate effectively to a diverse audience. The ability to formulate good questions. I mentioned our science teacher. You know, he hammers those kids about formulating a good question. He said, that is far more important to me than your answer. If you can't form a good question, you really won't be able to do science. So that's an important part of this type of education. And finally, a community of learners rejoicing in truth. I will tell you, I started the story of St. Jerome's when it was on its most dire. Well, where is it today? It has 335 kids. It would have more. They had space, but they have just announced that they will be expanding the school. In any given enrollment year, they're receiving about 180 applications, and they're only able to take about 60. Your brother Chris chases these people all the time. So they're going to start expanding the school with projections to reach that 500 mark again in about 7 or 8 years. It has borne tremendous fruit, both in terms of enrollment, but in terms of the joy and the engagement and the sense of unity and purpose that we have. So that's been my experience, and I am happy now to take some questions.
One question. The fourth principle is emphasis on language trivium. What else?
So the trivium addresses this grammar and logic and rhetoric. Both in language, but then across the curriculum.
Could you show it again?
Let's see. Where did I go? Yes. Okay, yes.
So for some of the older students that are going to 7th and 8th grade, since they didn't get experience to the phases of learning and things like that, like going through K through 2nd grade, how are we going to truly understand what
Right, right. That is an excellent question, and I can see you're feeling anxious, so I want to put you at ease about that. First of all, everyone will understand that, so there won't be any expectations. The second thing is, just as it's new and something you're learning, it's going to be new and something your teachers are learning, so you'll sort of do this together. No expectation, you won't be held responsible for something that you don't know, but they'll begin to teach you and form you in this way. You know, it's like if somebody were to offer you something, you know, really great, and you could only have it for a little while rather than a long while, you'd still want it even for a little while. And that's kind of been the experience of our kids. In the beginning, some of them felt a little anxious. You know what they felt the most anxious about? They were a little bothered by our integrated humanities core of literature, history, religion. They kept saying, what subject is this? You know, they wanted to know what to write in the notebook. So that's understandable. So there was a little bit of that. But then, you know what they found? It's actually really an interesting way to learn, and you learn interesting things that make you think and make you want to talk about it. Okay, good question. Okay, I'm not sure I'll be able to run. How do we want to do this? What's that?
I will run.
You'll be my runner? Okay.
Two quick questions. What does homework look like in this type of curriculum? I'm just thinking, it sounds like a lot, and when you have back-to-back-to-back kids, I don't have that much time.
No. Or patience, or,
patience.
yeah, understood. That's a great question about homework. Actually, interestingly, because this is so rich and engaging, our sense is they have really spent themselves at school. So we have more of a minimalist approach to homework, particularly when they're very little. Research actually supports that. There's not a lot of research that shows that homework actually helps or has any positive effect on learning. It often causes frustration and tears, and the tears don't have to be the child's. Let's face it, we've all been there. Now, when they advance into middle years, they're going to have more, but they're independent by then. So we take, like I said, more of that minimalist. We want them to develop fully, so we feel like, you know, after school is time to go out and run. They need to get in the dirt. They need to play. They need to be with their families. They need to develop their music or their athletics or whatever it may be. So.
Well, first thank you, because I have two older children, they will not come here. I'm so sad.
Oh.
But these make me feel that humanity will survive.
Yeah.
So, thank you very much. So how and where you will find or you will train a teacher, where they come from.
Where they come from.
And how many teachers, you mentioned Waldorf, and my girls went to
Oh,
Waldorf.
yeah.
And how many teachers in each grade, I think you say, are? And Waldorf has one teacher
Right.
for first through 8,
Yeah.
which is kind of
Right.
very difficult.
Right, right. In answer to your first question, where do these teachers come from? Well, they're already here. You know, I have no classical background. I was, you know, educated K-12 in Catholic schools. I went on to the University of Maryland, got my elementary ed degree, got a master's in administration. So I don't have that formation myself. But what I have is the ability to read and to learn and work together with teachers. I also had groups like the institute that I currently work for come and do training and formation of teachers. So that's something, you know, we'll be looking at with this school. Someone to actually come in and help them with the pedagogy and the content and show them how to plan integrated units. It's a very natural way to teach. So once you get past your fear and your anxiety, I find teachers kind of go, oh yes, this is why I've always wanted to teach. So don't be too stressed about that. We have lots of ways we can help to form, and there's a lot of shared reading that teachers will do, reading and discussing things together. And then in terms of the setup, no, it's nothing like Waldorf. We actually have, one teacher per class, and sometimes an aide if it's a very young class.
Hi, thank you so much for coming.
Sure.
My name is Faith Hopp, otherwise known as Hishdock's mom, I'm a 7th grader. And I really liked some of the things you were talking about as far as getting kids to talk in complete sentences, because I teach at the university level, and that's a huge issue. The only thing that I was just slightly concerned about, and I'm pretty sure you can put me at ease about this, is you mentioned copying and modeling, and I can't tell you how many times we have to deal with plagiarism, and it's just such a growing trend. So I'm wondering how you kind of distinguish that.
Sure, thank you. That's a good question. When I'm talking about copy work, I'm talking about kindergarten and 1st grade copying a sentence from something that they've read. The ability to do that well, the skill in doing that is to habituate them to what good language looks and sounds like, the actual proper structure of a sentence. By the time they are 5th, 6th, they should not be copying anything. But hopefully we have given them the tools to be able to develop their own style in writing. That's a big part. I think that what you're speaking about speaks to kind of what Dr. Hanby found too, which is, kids don't know what else to do. I'm sure you've had papers turned in with hyperlinks still in them. They don't know what else to do because they haven't had it taught to them at the depth and at the pace that's really proper. So our goal would be, we hope kids that come out of St. Thomas Apostle will be writing the kinds of things that would make your heart sing as a college professor. That's what our hope is. That's our hope.
I was just wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about the transition of your school with St. Jerome. I think that's kind of where a lot of our anxiety comes from. We're kind of on this precipice right now.
Yeah.
So maybe a little bit specifically about how long did it take till you really saw what you would call success? Mm-hmm. And also, what are some of the biggest regrets or things that you might change about during that transition period?
Good, yeah, good questions. I think our community experienced it in a way that's probably similar to the way you experienced it. It felt like all of a sudden there's this new thing. Oh, now we're sort of in the fight of our life as a school, and we're making this big fundamental change. So people were anxious, they were concerned. I spent a lot of time talking with parents over various things, trying to reassure them that we were going to do our best to make this, as good an implementation as we could. Things like this do take time to really develop. So while we implemented from the start, teachers had been formed, we had workshops, we had various things, I would say realistically, it probably took 2 to 3 years for the teachers to begin sort of humming. Now, having said that, things are continuing in the classroom, but slowly you're seeing teachers adding things. Teachers would say that to me. They'd come up and say, you know what, I finally tried a Socratic discussion. So it's things being added over time. I will say that some of the parents who were most anxious in the beginning have turned out to be like the greatest champions. They've seen the fruits of it. Their kids are coming home excited about what they've learned. They're jumping in the car and asking their parents about the Peloponnesian War and sending the parents home to Google exactly what that's about. We were sending, we will send, this is one little piece of homework we'll send, which is the philosophy question of the week. And we just encourage you to talk about it at your dinner table. And then, the kids come back on Friday and they sort of share their discussion. So over time, the anxiety's lessened for everyone, but I'd say 2 to 3 years before it felt like something that looked like I would call classical.
Do they use the Montessori method?
We have
I say Montessori, not preschool, because in Europe they do the Montessori up to 12, 13
Yeah.
years of age?
No, we do have a Montessori preschool. So we only do the toddler and primary rooms, but the rest of the school is classical.
Because we had poetry recitation and acting.
Yeah, there's a lot of similarities, but we felt that the classical offered a better expression of the kind of cultural knowledge and understanding that kids would need moving forward. Yes?
I found your articulation of the framework very clear, and I saw it in the Washington Post article as well, which to me has been the thing that I've read that I walked away and said, okay, maybe I can get my head around this.
Yeah.
What I am unclear on is if that is the same framework that is applied across the U.S. or however geographically broad this concept is, or is every parish, every state doing it in a different way. And then while this is St. Jerome's experience, I'm unclear on what our experience will be.
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. Catholic classical education is really a set of principles. It's not so much a systematized thing that I can hand you and you can open the box and just, So having said that, it will look a little bit different everywhere. For example, the schools up in the UP in Marquette, they're using something called the Core Knowledge Series. This has been developed by E.D. Hirsch. It also happens to be chronological and tells history in the comprehensive, cohesive way. But they've chosen sort of different materials. I've seen some schools place a greater emphasis on great books and seminar style learning. That's an element of this. Some people will emphasize that over other things. There's great commonality in the schools that I go to, but there certainly are some local differences. And then what was your other question? How will it look here?
Right, so that framework,
Yeah.
is that, even if the way it operationalizes is a little different, is that framework and that philosophy by K through 2 and 3 through whatever, and is that a similar framework?
Yeah, that would be a good question for Tim. To what degree do you expect to adopt like the Trivium framework?
We want to take full advantage of the wisdom in that approach and being able to align how we teach with where the children are at in terms of their cognitive development. That's sort of the genius of that approach to education, being able to really draw the most out of the child, have them experience the most they can of a learning experience by aligning their the pedagogy of the classroom with where they're at cognitively. So definitely we'll be implementing that in a full way. Did that answer your question?
Sort of.
And could you repeat your question for me one more time?
So she talked about the K through 2, and here's how it operationalizes, and 3 through 6, or
Yeah.
whatever grade it was, and then through 8th grade. And there was a very clear way that each of those phases are approached.
Yes.
Are we going to follow that sort of framework, and in these grades we're going to go after those sorts of learning, targeted learning?
Yes. And yes, we are, because what Mary Pat has outlined there draws from the principles that are at play in terms of those levels of learning and the pedagogy that goes into. Our teachers, for example, will be part of their training. They're going to be at the Institute for Catholic Liberal Education Training in July. But there's also an online series produced by Academic Press that goes into, there's about an hour long, presentation on 8 different principles, pedagogical principles that have different applications at different ages. And so when a teacher has assimilated those principles, they begin living those out for those children. Our staff is going to be trained in those, working with the ICLE, working with Academic Press. Mary Pat will be here in August, pardon me, to train our teachers in those pieces specifically herself. So she'll be able to work with our teachers at that time. Can I ask you a question?
Sure, sure.
We had a question last time when we were here last week that it's relatively easy to find schools that have implemented classical education and succeeded.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how can we find out about those that haven't?
Sure. That's a good question, and my honest to goodness answer is I'm not aware of any that have failed. That's not to say that they haven't, but the schools that I've been working directly with, and actually I was working with schools, even when I was still at St. Jerome's as principal, because I had principals calling me, going, help, what can I do? And I'm not familiar at this point with any that have not succeeded in this model, which I think is a good sign. You had a question too, and then how did we?
We'll take turns.
Okay, you take turns. Good. Duet.
I noticed that you were talking about the difference, like 5th grade being a hinge grade, and then somebody was talking about 6th versus 7th and 8th. Because of the financial situation of our school, we are having to have combined classrooms. 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, 7 and 8. So those 5th graders who are on the hinge shouldn't necessarily be with the 6th. They might, in the 7th and the 8th, because like Allie said, they've never been through it. And I know you said in all the systems you've had, there was 1 teacher per each grade.
Yeah.
Which is going to make it more challenging for any teacher in these combined classrooms. So how can we best ensure that each grade and each age level is being served, even though we have to, by necessity, have combined classes?
Sure. That's a great question. And while, which is the question about having the combined classes, how would this work? And while St. Jerome's didn't have combined classrooms, many of the schools I work with do. Because of their size, or because some of them are just starting out, or what have you. And what has to happen there is the teacher then has to sort of become very grounded in the aims that govern the different grade levels. So that if you're a 5th and 6th grade combination, you're going to study the same content, just for unity, and that's something you can decide at your level. Most of the schools I work with will choose to have the 5th, 6th grade study, for example, the classic cultures. So they'll both do this. But as teacher, I would differentiate assignments. I would be having 5th graders working a little more in the grammar setting. So they're going to be doing a lot of map work, who, what, where, character descriptions, while in the 6th grade, they should be able to compare cultures a little bit more. They might be prompted to discuss why the Athenians and Spartans were so different. So it does require some differentiation, which I'm sure they're doing now, your teachers. But there's a unity in sort of content that brings them together.
This question is more for Mr. DeLaura. In your emails that you sent out recently, answering our questions from the last time, you talked about the hiring committee. Based on the people you have listed there, how are we ensuring that we have diversity and perspective, and making sure that the middle school is represented, knowing that most of the middle school is not, at least teacher-wise, is not returning, to ensure that we have the right teachers in place to broaden the minds of our middle schoolers to prepare them for high school?
Thanks, Karen. Actually, I'm very happy to announce that Mrs. Zoll is going to be on our interview committee. She stepped up, and we were very happy to have her experience, her expertise, her keenness, her commitment, her passion with us. So we're very excited about that. So thank you, Pam, for jumping in and making the difference. So, but actually, a nice summary, Karen, that we need to be able to capture at each of these levels that quality that is going to allow a student to engage the child where they're at those grade levels. And I have a question for Mary Pat.
Yeah.
You mentioned that relates to this whole issue. So you made reference to standards-driven education. And we know there needs to be standards,
Right.
as sort of a benchmark,
Right.
or a reference to help a teacher know the breadth of instruction in terms of content that a student should be exposed to. How do standards function in a classical education setting compared to a more conventional?
Sure. That's an excellent question, because Mr. DeLaura is quite right. This isn't about doing away with standards. It's actually about properly ordering them. I believe that the standards-based movement has gotten off track for one reason. They have forgotten that standards are the minimum. They're the lowest. They're the things you must teach. But they've been elevated to this highest thing. So we're actually teaching to standards, and it's brought education, I think, down somewhat. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. St. Jerome Academy, when we went through this, and we have this unique educational plan written by this team of volunteers, we were tasked by the Archdiocese with comparing that educational plan to the existing standards of the Archdiocese of Washington. So we did this exhaustive, extensive thing. As I expected, we meet and exceed them in most places. But what it means for a teacher is this. A teacher is responsible to know the standards for a particular grade level. But you would almost, instead of starting with the standards as this is what's going to guide me in my teaching, you're going to use the standards to sort of check where you've been. For example, there's a standard in, it's one of the literature standards, I think, for 5th or 6th grade, and it's defining the protagonist in a story. Okay, fine. That's a very simple thing, and the teacher's lesson is going to be more complex. The teacher might be teaching a lesson about whether the monster Grendel in Beowulf was capable of love. It's a larger question that requires kids to think more deeply about that character, that protagonist, so that by the end of that lesson they'll understand the protagonist as the character that moves the action forward, but they will have actually entertained deeper thoughts. That's why we don't call this standards driven, but we certainly use standards to check and evaluate what we're teaching. Does that make sense? Hopefully. Okay.
How would they be qualifying, so to speak, the learning between the 5th and 6th grade students who are in the same classroom?
Do you mean in terms of grading and assessing their work?
Yes.
Yeah, so assessment in this kind of approach is much more diverse because you have more diverse experiences. Sometimes there's discussion to be assessed, sometimes there's tests and quizzes, like always, essays and writing pieces, and the teachers will continue to do those and assign those to the different grades, maintaining grades for each student.
As I shared previously, that there is a cooperative education. And so when you have a classroom with 5th and 6th graders, how can you do the cooperative work that will be able to grade the students who are in the 4th and 5th versus the 5th, or the 5th versus the 6th?
Well, I mean, the work that happens in the classroom, sometimes it will be cooperative, may be part of the way kids are learning, but they are individually responsible for their learning. So you still have to grade them individually on what they have learned, even if they've learned it in a cooperative setting.
So how would they be able to grade the educational competency?
Well, by reading what kids are writing, essentially. The degree to which they explain what they've learned, the degree...
But that is in a cooperative extent where the whole group...
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Carmen, could you catch up with Mary Pat and I after the meeting?
Yeah.
And we'll capture some of these other questions. We'll be able to address that more carefully.
I can speak loudly.
Oh, very good.
Tack on question to Mr. DeLaura's question about transition. I think somebody else over here also mentioned that. I think that's where some of the concerns were. You said it took about 2 years for things to kind of transition over. I am more concerned about the short-term transition. Mm-hmm. And I would like to know, from your experience, what did the darkest hour look like for transition? And what have you done differently based on that experience?
Well, let's see, The Darkest Hour. Isn't that a Winston Churchill film?
Big fan.
Yeah. think the hardest thing for me was feeling like I was working against a clock that was running out because we were so close to being closed. And when you feel like you are running against the clock, there's a tendency to want to hurry and push. And so I think in the beginning I felt some disappointment our first year. After our first year, our enrollment pretty much stayed stable, and I got a little down about that because I thought, gee, this is really supposed to help us grow. Where are all these people? But it was the next year, and we began to really see enrollment increase, number one. And that's partly because, you know, people are out there watching, they're hearing the story of St. Thomas, they were hearing the story of St. Jerome, they were interested, but they wanted to wait and see. So that's one dynamic to be aware of. But the second one was the mistakes that I would say that I've made would have been in being unrealistic about what I was capable of and what my teachers could handle in terms of the amount and rate of change. Just it takes the human person time to begin to understand and to assimilate new approaches and new understandings. So I think if I had it to do over again, I would be a little more strategic in my implementation. I might define better which areas would be fuller, and that's actually, as my work as a consultant, that's what I do with schools now.
Which lead time do you have?
Oh, well, let's see, January of 2010. So my consultation meeting was November 2009. January 2010, the curriculum committee forms. I sort of formed them at coffee hour after Mass. I mean, it was very organic. They write the program feverishly, finish it in May. I'm in the process of trying to hire teachers. There's a lot of upset around a separate issue regarding sisters who had been assigned to the parish. And I really couldn't even start forming the teachers till about August with a September opening. So it was a crunch for everybody.
Mary Pat, could I add on to that? Let's not lose track of your questions,
Yeah.
sir. And
Well, we're looking at designing the schedule next year, and actually this came up in a conversation with Mary Pat today, to actually incorporate that once a month, a half day, so that teachers can receive professional development. We'll be having every Wednesday, like we do now, an after-school staff meeting. On the first Wednesday of the month, that would be a half a day, so that we would actually have 3-4 hours of having a guest trainer come in, being able to have them work on integrated unit planning. And so I don't know if that would remain after next year, but that struck me as a very helpful means. But the bottom line is that we're going to be providing these 3 particular experiences of training over the summer, but training is going to continue. The large majority of our after-school staff meetings won't be meetings. They'll be workshops where teachers will be working on hands-on materials either together or with support in learning. And so we're all going to be living in this learning community of professionals for years. And there was a beautiful story of just a teacher who, and I think Mary Pat, you referred to this as well, that teachers become inspired by this kind of experience. They see the power of it for them as a professional and as a learner.
Great, okay,
Did you find that, this is something I thought of, the fact that you said that it took teachers maybe a year or 2 or 3, or any of us, time just to change. I mean,
Yeah.
Especially you said you were a teacher for 17 years, you're in your habits, every person has them.
Yep.
And so my question to you was, from the teachers that stayed at St. Jerome and continued on, versus teachers who came in totally new with maybe not those habits, did you find that they had kind of an equal growth? Was it harder for the newer teachers? Was it harder for the, I'll say older, but more experienced teachers? Or is it kind of even, it depend on the person?
That's an interesting question, because there is certainly an uphill climb for someone like me who had 17 years behind her in the classroom, and having to rethink. Even, you know, teachers grow attached to what we teach. You know, I always do that Native American unit. I always do that dinosaur unit. So that was a difficulty for them. The teachers who came in new, it's very hard to find anyone who has had a classical formation. I was finding people who had maybe a liberal arts background. Their struggle wasn't so much with embracing this new material because it was all new to them. They struggled with the things that our veteran teachers were very competent at, which is like classroom management and pacing. So what I found was interesting was they were able to really work together and help each other. And in my work now with teachers, I'm very conscious that I may have a veteran teacher who's new to this approach, who understands how to manage kids, who understands grading, who understands all those things, but needs to be formed in this new content and pedagogy. Likewise, you may find that you have a graduate of University of Dallas or Benedictine or Hillsdale or TAC coming, and they need to be grounded in how to manage and run the classroom. So it's a strength that they can kind of give each other. Okay, and then I'm coming to you, yes.
I'm basically repeating a question from the last meeting, but I'd like to hear your answer to it.
Oh, great.
There are definitely problems with the curriculum that we have now and that type of curriculum. But and the classical curriculum sounds fabulous, but what are the problems with that? Because I can't imagine that it's
There's no
completely
problems.
flawless.
She has got a future, right? For sure. Definitely. I should have known. I should have known. You are quite right. It's not flawless and it's not perfect, and my school isn't perfect and your school isn't perfect, and that's certainly the case. I would say one of the difficulties we run into is that classical education is intended to study fewer things but at greater depth, okay? That can be difficult in the real world when things interrupt your school schedule, like an ice storm and school's closed. It can be difficult when kids are absent for a couple days in a row because we're talking about experiential learning. It's not like we can just send home worksheets to catch you up. That's a difficulty, how to keep kids plugged in when they lose time in school. And this isn't so much related to curriculum, but it was always a challenge for me to have to find substitute teachers. A day here and there isn't a big thing, but if somebody went out on maternity leave, I needed to find a teacher who either grasped this or was really willing to learn quickly. So those are some of the things that I'd say I found. Excellent question. Wait till I tell your uncle about you.
I'm hoping you can speak to, as a principal that kind of had to help a parent community through this change, if there were any practices, any processes that you were able to put in place just to allow parents to have a positive response to that change and just that transition.
Yep. To a large extent, doing what you're doing right now, which is having the chance to talk about your concerns, maybe express anxieties, express dissatisfaction. We had plenty of that at St. Jerome as well. I found that communicating frequently and having an open door, having meetings like this, helped people to understand that we were very serious in our understanding of your concern and anxiety. And we know that this will only succeed with your buy-in. It's a beautiful program, but if there's no one here to experience it, it's not going to go anywhere. So we were aware, as I think your pastor and principal are aware, of how critically important you are, and that you feel brought into the journey as well.
What time of day does your day start at St. Jerome?
School starts at 8, well, they come in at 8 o'clock and they start instruction at 8:15 and they dismiss at 3:10.
So, thank you. My main concern centers around the time frame of this change. You had mentioned that at St. Jerome, you started consulting in November, started drafting a curriculum in January, and was done by May with hiring teachers in there. We're looking at doing it in 2 months. what guidance would you give our school for, you know, you said the main drawback is don't ask hasty, but seriously, what advice
Yeah.
for this 2-month window can you give us?
I totally get it. And one thing you have to remember is that so when St. Jerome started, this is how fairly recent this wave of classical education has been. There weren't too many curricular models for us to look at, so we had to build our own. You have the advantage of having models that you can look at, whether it's the St. Jerome model, whether it's the Chesterton model, whether it's the Core Knowledge series like they do in Marquette. So in a sense, you're no further behind where I was. While this curriculum committee is doing this, I'm not able to start forming teachers. I'm not able to start anything really until August. I had hoped to start in June, but I was still hiring teachers. I didn't have everybody in place, so I had to wait. So I think substantively, you're pretty much where we were actually. Now I know you have a curriculum committee forming or formed that will be looking at that. So you can, at least you have things you can draw from. They had to create from nothing, which I think is why it took so very, very long for them to go. It's not, you know, I look back on it and I think, there had to have been an easier way to do this. But in a sense, I'm grateful for the experience of going through it together. The sooner you start, the sooner you can begin to reap the benefits. So I think once you do get started, you'll see the growth and the gradual emergence of the picture. So I wouldn't be too anxious. You're not, certainly relative to St. Jerome. Now there's some schools that don't have the existential problem that you and I share. And they have sort of at their leisure. You know, I was in Pensacola, the school where I was visiting, I had 480 kids. They're not in any danger, so they could sort of, we'll start with the history and literature piece this year, and then the following year we'll do this. You and I we're in different circumstances, so circumstances necessitate a quicker thrust, but it doesn't mean that your implementation won't turn out well. I don't lose hope in that. Yes?
Yeah, I don't know if I need this, but you've done a great job. The curriculum sounds fascinating, and the integration of a lot of it. I think the thing that we're worried about as a family is the community around the students right now, right? And there's a critical mass conversation, and the speed with which we're kind of rolling this out, I think we're struggling with that a little bit. So I appreciate your time today, but I'm curious from Tim where we stand for enrollment and where we stand for teachers.
I'll grab that back to him, yeah.
Right now we're at, 23 students in our preschool, which is normal for right around now. And we're at about 70 students who are enrolled in K through 8. Now we know that people are in the midst of making a decision, so we're not, we're waiting too as a community together in a sense. And tonight and trying to communicate and build a common understanding and a common confidence, common hope, common vision is the work to be done. There are no ways of guaranteeing. Father Bill has made clear that this school is going forward, and the parish community is with us here tonight and spiritually, financially, of course. And so I wish it was possible to nail down what our numbers were going to be, but in any case, we'll have the teachers to fill those 5 classrooms. This week is when we'll be finalizing what we're hearing from the teachers that are currently on board. The openings that we may have will begin to fill. The teachers were provided at the time when we invited them to pursue the positions that we were going to have. That job description, that position descriptions, those exist now. We'll be able to post those as needed. And this is the time now that teachers are looking for jobs. And I mentioned this last time that we would hope to have our hiring squared away by the beginning of June, so that we can begin training at the first, we'll be able to work together before that, but the ICLE conference is at the end of July. So we're all trusting in different ways. And but to your point, I think this was the heart of your point, that it's like community is essential to a school, to learning, to a school, the relationships that are there. And that's another part of the difficulty and the struggle, is that we're seeing our community being drawn in different directions, being called in different directions, that are decisions that each family make, and that's painful. And yet we're going through this because there is a history of many other schools who have suffered that same kind of separation, transformation of the community, and yet within that difficulty there is a new life that comes forth, that touches people in other parts of the community, possibly draws others back who may have chose to leave because of uncertainties. And so actually we're in a much better place than Mary Pat would have been, because she was she was the first Catholic school to do this, so she was really reaching out. But we do have others' experiences who have been able to show that this does bring new community out of an existing one, or one that has gotten smaller, and out of it comes a newer, bigger one. Brandon?
Just to make sure we're on the same page. So right now, you've got 70 enrolled. You've got 5 teaching spots in total.
Right.
How many have you hired to date?
Pardon?
Have you hired any of those slots to date?
No. We're waiting to hear back from this week. Teachers are getting back to us from our current staff. We gave them complete access, of course, to the 5 positions, the classical educator positions. So we haven't done any posting or anything of positions until we know for sure where everyone stands, and then we'll post and hire.
How many applications you've received so far?
Actually, I have been receiving applications just without having, invited any. And I've gotten 3 just spontaneously. Heard you're going to classical, would love to get involved. Here's my resume.
What I meant